Okay, welcome everybody. I think we'll go ahead and get started while you all trickle in. My name is Zoe Peterson. I work in the Student Academic Success Office, so we are the ones who put on webinars and the Distinguished Speaker Series for students to attend. Today, our speaker is Austin Tremblay. He will present his webinar titled The Right Stuff, Leveraging Process and Feedback to Produce Work. Austin has a PhD from the University of Houston, and he's taught writing courses in higher education for over 15 years. He currently works, sorry, my cats are in the background, and I do apologize if you can hear them, but he currently works as an instructional technologist in the Center for Learning, Design, and Technology, and he teaches in the engineering management program within EP. So, everybody, let's welcome Austin, and I'll turn things over to him.
Thank you. Happy to be presenting today. I've done a few of these tech writing webinars for EP, and I just tried to spotlight myself and accidentally muted myself, so that was fun. But yeah, welcome in. Really glad for y'all to be here. Thanks for taking time out of your day to talk about one of my favorite things, which is writing. And I know it can be a touchy subject, so thanks for braving that and being willing to spend time, talking about this. My goal is to present, but also for it to very much feel like a conversation. I want it to feel open for you to jump in. If you have a question, if something I say doesn't make sense, please feel free to just, raise your hand in Zoom or even to unmute and just ask a question. Just call me by name and get my attention so that we can figure out how to best help you with this fun thing called writing. So I'm going to share here and we'll get started with the presentation. All right, so you can see my title here. As is the convention in academic writing, you have to have a title and a subtitle. That's like one of the conventions of the genre of academic writing. So, I just like to think of this in less highfalutin, less fancy speak as, how to produce more writing. How can you produce more writing? Now, this first slide, I like to collect quotes about writing, and I really like this one a lot from George R.R. Martin. He says, "Some writers enjoy writing, I'm told. Not me. I enjoy having written." For me, I've taught writing for a long time. I've written in various capacities for a very, very long time, and I do not necessarily enjoy it. It is not typically an enjoyable task, and it's a little bit blasphemous to say that. But just being real with you, it's not always a fun task when you're in the middle of doing it, because it can be complex, it can be frustrating, just like any iterative process. You have lots of failure as you go along, but luckily you can keep going, and then you can say, "Oh, I did do it. I now can enjoy it looking back on it. I now can enjoy having achieved my goal of writing this thing." Here's another quote that I just like to keep in mind when I'm thinking about writing. Done is better than perfect. And I think there's a tendency when we think about writing to think that our first draft has to be absolutely pitch perfect, that it has to be phenomenal, and that we have to start there. And again, just like with any iterative process, that's not likely where we're going to start. Maybe we catch lightning in a bottle and we start there one, but typically that's not where we're going to start. We're going to start, with something far less than perfect, and we're going to keep iterating until it gets better and better. But we don't want that fear or that pressure that we feel to be perfect to get in the way of us completing the project. We want to actually be able to complete it, because if we've completed it, then that's better than just trying to be perfect with it and not getting it done. So those are just two things that I think of a lot when I think about getting writing done, and particularly technical writing, which is, can be a little bit more tedious in the sense that it's detail driven. It involves a lot of data usually. And so it's not necessarily as fun as a more creative writing that we might pursue, but still I'm going to give you some strategies and some ways to think about that process that can help you just be productive in there. So the way that I think about, framing this entire talk is I want to think about what are some traditional tools that we can use, what are some nascent or some newfangled tools that have just come about that we can use to develop a writing practice, to improve on our existing writing practice so that we're more productive. How can we create a place or a community that gives us feedback? How can we create that feedback system so that we're incentivized to keep going, so that we're held accountable for finishing our work and getting it done? And then how can we combine those two things so that we're ultimately more productive, using those tools, utilizing a feedback system to ultimately produce more papers, more writing than we would have otherwise. All right, so I'm going to argue that we all have a writing process. Even if you don't think that you have a writing process, I would bet that you have some kind of process in place when you are completing your writing. I do prefer the term practice as opposed to process. I always kind of make myself laugh a little bit when I talk about this because I just hear the Allen Iverson quote about practice. I don't know if there's any NBA fans in this meeting, but I just hear Allen Iverson saying, we're in here talking about practice every time I say the word practice. But I think it's a much better term for me because process can sometimes feel daunting. It can sometimes feel like too big a thing, but practice is something you do daily. Practice is something that you can do habitually and that feels like something you can just jump into. And it doesn't feel like, oh, I got to understand this whole huge process in order to get started. So I'm curious from you what your writing process looks like now. And I'm going to just launch a poll here real quick, and I'm going to ask you to consider and choose some of these options. You should be able to multi-select in this poll, and I just ask you to select if any of these resonate with what you currently do. Like, say you've got a writing project, you've got to sit down and create a piece of writing. Are these any thing that resonates with you in terms of how you approach that project right now? I'll give you another, say, 30 seconds to take a look at this poll and get your answers in, and then I'll share the results with you so that we can take stock of where we all are. A couple seconds here. I see we're halfway. We're at 54% participated. We're off 63% now. We're jumping up. Almost done. Almost done. Just a couple more seconds for people to answer. Okay. I will go ahead and end the poll now, and you should be able to see the results. And so this one, get a little bit done at a time, is a popular one that seems resonant here for this group. And then complete large chunks at one time is also resonant for this group. So that's really interesting. asking for feedback. That's great to see as a number 2 slot in here. And then it's interesting that some folks, and I don't mean to laugh to disparage you. This is something that I used to do a lot. I would never show my draft to anybody until it was complete. So that's interesting that it might be a tendency of ours, especially when we're first starting out writing, to want to keep and protect that draft until we feel like it's in good shape. So that's cool. I appreciate you chiming in with your own experience there. I'll stop sharing those results so that we can take a look at ways that we can think about that practice and sort of hack it in a way. So one thing is, for me at least, absolutely making writing a routine, making your practice a routine is so key. And, you see this if you look at any sports or any other thing really that's a craft where people have learned a skill and they're applying the skill. If they make it a practice, a habitual practice of showing up and putting in the work, it helps them be way, way more productive. You'd be surprised at how much more productive you can be if you just make it a habitual practice, if you put yourself in the space and actually just get things done on a regular schedule. And I'll give you another example of this real quick. I work remotely. I'm have the privilege of working remotely, and I work here at home. I haven't gone into an office in many years now, but every time before I start working, before I sit down at my desk, I will put cologne on. And when I tell people this, they're like, "Why are you putting cologne on? You're making your wife suffer in walking around the house and smelling you." But I actually do that because to me, it gets my mind and my body in the space that I need to be in to understand, oh, I'm about to start work. For me, that's just a trigger for both my mind and body to say, okay, it's time to go to work now. If you develop that sort of routine or that habitual practice of whatever it is that makes you feel like you're now going to go to work, and you apply that to your writing, I guarantee you that you will have a much better success rate of producing work. You will be able to produce work at a much greater rate. I definitely advise folks to make sure that your practice is both reproducible and it's attainable. So if I said, all right, leave this webinar and, next week, start up a practice, and, you should write 5 hours a day, and you should get up at 4 in the morning in order to have time to do that. Nobody's going to do that, right? We don't have capacity for that, especially being working professionals. You can't do that. So make sure that it's something that's attainable or manageable for you, because otherwise you're not going to stick to it. Just like if you try to stick to any other habit you develop. I tried to train for running a while back, and I tried to start by running like 3 miles at a time. That was my start. And then I quickly realized I hadn't run in a long time. And I was like, oh, wow. Now I don't even want to go outside because it seems too long. I needed to back that down to a more manageable size to get started. Then I could increase it once I made it habitual. But it's got to be something that is attainable and is reproducible. So if you say, okay, I know how to get myself in the space. I need a string quartet to be playing beside me, and I need to be under a chandelier, and I need the lighting to be just so, and I need several candles around me. you've got to set up something that is reproducible and easily reproducible so that you don't get in your own way, so that you're not an impediment to the habit forming and to you sticking to that habit. The other thing, and some people mentioned that they're already doing this, I love seeing that, is break the pieces of writing down so that they are incremental, so that the work is being accomplished incrementally. It's so smart to me anyway to break the work down in this way because it allows you the satisfaction of completing a little section. And then there's nothing like a positive reinforcement where you finish a little section and then you're like, oh yeah, I nailed that. I got it done. I'm going to come back and I'm going to do another one. If you try, now some people said they do produce in large chunks, and if that works for you, fantastic. I'm not trying to tell you don't do what you already do that works. But for me anyway, those small pieces make it much more manageable to accomplish your writing than trying to just knock out huge chunks of text, especially with technical stuff. Again, with that data, with the tedium that can happen when you're trying to analyze things and you're trying to synthesize things and put everything together. That's hard work, and it's a lot of it requires a lot of brain power to do that. So, if you try to do that in long, large chunks, it's often going to be exhausting, and it's hard for you to come back and do more at that point. So those little pieces help a lot. Now, another big thing that I think a lot of people don't do with their writing, but they do in other forms of work, is to track your progress. Build yourself some type of project management. And by that, it could just be a spreadsheet in which you keep track of your progress. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to get on like Monday.com and buy a subscription or Asana or anything like that. If you have access to those tools, that's awesome and you can utilize them. But it can just be as simple as even writing, handwriting a little thing. If you don't like to work digitally, you can just, keep track in a little notebook and say, hey, I put in this amount of time today. There are two reasons why I suggest this. One is that, again, it helps incentivize you to get it done because you can see how much you've accomplished and you can feel good about having accomplished it. But two, you can track the various pieces and you know where you're at with each piece. We've all, experienced where we've got a section we feel like is done of a piece of writing, and then we move on to a different section, but then we need to come back to that initial one. If I don't know where I'm at in that initial one, it's much harder to get back into the space to revise that. But if I do know and I have some sense of where I'm at with that, if I've notated it for myself, like, oh, I struggled with this, or this still needs citations, or whatever it is, then I can go back into that much more easily. So I can re-enter that space and the headspace of working in that. The other thing I'd say is to give yourself as much permission as you can, as much as you need to. I have a friend who wrote a really fantastic book called Permission to Be Human, and it's all about giving yourself permission to do whatever you need to do to feel fulfilled as a human being. I would say the same thing applies to writing. Give yourself the permission you need. So if you feel like you need a break, then stop. It's okay to stop. If you feel like you're in a flow and everything's going nicely for you, keep going. It doesn't have to be that you set up hard rules in your routine and then you say, all right, these rules are unbreakable. You are you have complete agency. You are the agent in that habit that you set up. So you can do that for sure. Another thing that I find really awesome to do, especially for a project, is to use this WOOP model. I'm curious if anybody in here has used this model or if anybody's familiar with it. Feel free to jump in if you are. But it's a model that was created by Gabrielle Ottingen, and um, it's just a four-piece model for narrowing down what your objective is for a project and then figuring out a practical way to achieve that objective. So the first part of it, each part corresponds to the letters in WOOP, and you're just going to say WOOP all the time. So, it's fun. But the first part of it is wish. And so you write down your most important wish, your goal. What is it that you're trying to achieve? And, we might say it's to finish up a grant application or finish up a white paper. And then you write down the outcome, the first O there. So what's the best outcome that's possible? What's the one that you'd really like to see, the ideal outcome? So, I win the grant. The white paper is published, in a sense that it offers people information, whatever that best outcome is that you imagine for that thing. Then the second O is naming the obstacle that may stand in your way of achieving that outcome or that objective. So what could be in the way? What could get in the way? And then the last piece is to plan. And this is the most practical maybe of all the four pieces. It's an if-then statement that helps you figure out how to get past that obstacle. And if you look at it like this is a way that you can format it. So you can write out that wish or that goal, objective, whatever word we want to use for it. We can then write out the outcome. We can write out the obstacle. And then that plan is always going to be in the form of if then. So if my wish is that I finish up this grant application and my outcome is that I win the grant, I get the funds to support this research project, my obstacle may be something like time management, my own time management. And then a plan that I could have is, well, if I notice or if I fall behind in my schedule, then I will create more specific tracking for tracking my progress. Or maybe my obstacle is capacity in terms of other work that I've got going on. And I can say a plan might be if I get distracted by other kinds of work, then I will build in reminders in my calendar that just offer a gentle reminder that I need to go back to that working on that grant app. So those are just some examples of how you might use this WOOP plan. And I'm curious if anybody has used this sorry, I'm skipping ahead a little bit there, or if you're familiar at all with this framework. Has anybody used this before? Feel free to answer in the chat if you don't want to unmute. You can also just say no. Nice. Awesome.
I haven't
Yeah,
used it.
that's interesting. Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted someone there.
I haven't used it before. This is new to me.
Awesome. Cool. Well, try it out. Let me know if it works for you and if it's something that's helpful for you. I'd love to know. Feel free to. I'm very findable in the JHU universe. So email me and let me know, or find me on Teams and say, hey, I used WOOP and it was terrible. Why did you tell me to do that? Or what I really sincerely hope is that it will be really helpful for you. And please let me know. Yeah, and Mattia, I hope I'm not butchering the pronunciation of your name, but I think that's probably true, right? You probably do often think of something like this subconsciously, but I'd encourage you to actually physically write this out. And I say that as someone who is very resistant sometimes to these sorts of models because I'm always like, no, I know that in my head. I don't need to put it on paper. But putting it on paper really solidifies that plan with yourself. It helps you hold yourself accountable. And it's just a nice way to visualize that work. So even if it just helps you understand the scope of your project, or sometimes I've actually done this and what I thought was my wish or my goal actually turned out to be something different than what I initially anticipated. So I think that it's a great way to both hold yourself accountable and to see visually on a page wherever you create these four pieces what you actually want to accomplish, what might be in the way, and a pretty practical plan to move forward. Awesome. I'm glad I got your name right. All right. So the other piece of this is how can we create that feedback system? Remember, that's our second question for this talk. So, we talked a little bit about how we can develop a practice, how we can make that habitual, how we can, practically apply that habit. But in terms of feedback and getting feedback from people, I just want you to take a minute here and think of some good feedback that you've received on something. And what I'm curious about is what the nature of that feedback was that made it good, right? Good is a maybe a little bit of a subjective term, but maybe I could say effective. What made it effective feedback that you received? And I would be willing to bet that that feedback was one of these things. It was probably empathetic. It worked to understand your goal and to see giving you feedback through the lens of understanding what your goals were. And or it was encouraging for you. It's the feedback helped you move forward or helped make you want to finish the project. Along with that, it may have been inspiring for you. It may have not only made you want to keep going, but actually got you into, the space to keep going. And you actually did it based on hearing this feedback from somebody. And maybe it was just timely, it was what you needed to hear at that moment, or it was timely in the sense of, wow, this is due in a couple weeks, and I really need to get some uh, some outside perspective on this. And before I give it to somebody as a completed draft, and maybe it was just you got that feedback at the right time to be able to turn it around and make some changes and then complete your draft. So these are, and this is not an exhaustive list of reasons why feedback might be effective, but I just consider that these things are really nice because they all contribute to you finishing the work. They help you move forward in the work, and our ultimate goal is to advance the work and to be productive. Seeking feedback does that for us, right? It can help us advance our work, and that's so key for us to find. Oh, and I forgot that I had a final one here. Maybe that feedback also was from a source that you really admire and you think, wow, this person is an expert in this. This is a SME, or this is somebody who's done this for a long time and they said it was really superb. So wow, that's great. another piece of inspiration there to move forward and to keep going with that work. Another way to think about feedback is like, it's a way to incentivize you to go back to the page. I talk about that with a lot of writing students. You got to get back to the page, find a reason to get back there. And a lot of times this feedback is a good reason. So feedback typically comes from community, and how and why we can create community around our own writing and our own feedback is super, super important. And because that community can serve not as an echo chamber, right? Not as a monolithic, one opinion sort of system, but instead as a diverse system that can give you lots of different perspectives, that can give you lots of different ways of thinking about that work that you're producing. And community can give you fresh eyes. So, oftentimes I will see things in a piece of mine after giving it to somebody else that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. And so it's so nice to just get that fresh set of eyes because, I've been looking at it for a long time. It's great to get somebody else's input to see new things in there. And this is another way of helping to hold you accountable. So, writing groups that I've been a part of, writing communities that I have both just joined and actually, been intentional about building, they've all helped hold me accountable. They've all said to me, all right, here's a deadline, and you got to get this to me so that I can give you feedback. You got to show me something so that I can have something to respond to. And they also can be a champion of your work and getting that done. And then they can inspire you to actually go back to the page and finish that draft so that you've not only been held accountable for drafting, but now you're inspired to go back once you get that feedback. And then they provide opportunities to just practice something. So if you're kind of worried about a type of writing or a piece of writing that you're just not super familiar with, it can give you an opportunity to practice that in front of a kind audience instead of somebody who might not be as generous a reader. So you have an opportunity there to get some encouraging feedback for something that's a little new for you or just a little unfamiliar that you're still learning about. These are all great reasons for developing a community, and I encourage you to be super intentional about building these communities. If you're in EP courses, you have a community of students who are motivated, who are talented, who can offer you lots of assistance in this way. Look to faculty members as a source of this as well. I'm positive, speaking from my own faculty experience, but also just on behalf of other faculty members, I know that we're interested in helping out in these ways and then doing what we can to support your work. So don't forget about that aspect of trying to build these community feedback systems. I love this quote from Jean Vanier. I think I'm pronouncing that one correctly. My French is not so great. But one of the marvelous things about community is that it enables us to welcome and help people in a way we couldn't as individuals. Isn't that a beautiful sentiment? The great thing about putting together a feedback system like that is that it goes beyond your individual work and it becomes a larger thing that is impactful, that is powerful, and that can help you ultimately produce whatever you're working on. So as I said, look to potential mentors, previous mentors, that you've had, in other contexts, in undergrad. And then the key thing here when you reach out to people and you're trying to put together a system, a community like this, is to let people know how they can be useful. I've had former students reach out to me and say things like, could you help me with this thing? And of course, I'm absolutely willing to, but a more specific question, can you take a look at the first 5 pages of this or the first 2 sections of this and give me some feedback about it is a much easier thing to respond to. Then I understand the capacity that I'm being asked to lend, and I just understand the task better. So let people know, and don't be afraid of letting people know how they can be useful. If you don't need somebody to read the whole thing, or if you don't need feedback on a particular type of skill, like you're like, no, I got the grammar locked down, like I don't need to know if you think this is a comma splice, then don't be afraid to let people know how they can best help you. Just let them know specifically how they can be useful to you. And like I said, you're in a community of EP students, utilize that community. You have that at your disposal, and it's a privilege to have that at your disposal. So definitely utilize that. It will fly by, and you don't always maintain all of those connections, but when you're a current student like that, it's great to have that sort of community around you that you can turn to for feedback. And I always say about this sense of community and feedback, you want to try to be less transactional and more transformational. What I mean by that is, think about it in the sense of how you can help each other in a feedback system grow and learn about your own work, about each other's work, and less about like a sort of tit for tat thing where it's like, well, I don't know, if you do this thing, then I guess I can do you a favor. Thinking about it in that transactional way to me is much less interesting than thinking about it in the ways that your work can actually transform through feedback. So it's just a nice way to think about putting that together. And productivity takes a lot of time. Sorry, this is a little grainy. I obviously pulled this off of some e-cards, but I just think this is kind of funny that procrastination is just getting things done that you were eventually going to be on your to-do list, maybe. I understand procrastination. I succumb to it sometimes, but true productivity takes time, and you have to understand that. You have to understand that when you build out your goals. So you have to sort of allow for the time that productivity can take. Here's another way of kind of thinking about how you might be productive, your own productivity. This is a PDCA cycle, or a lot of times I hear it talked about as a Deming cycle. And I'm curious if people have seen or used this model as well. But there are 4 steps here. The first is to form a plan. And you might say, hey, I know how I could form a plan. It's the last part of WHOOP. So just putting that out there, that you could fold that into this real easily. But the first part is you form a plan. The second part is that you iterate. You say, all right, based on that plan, I'm going to create a version of the thing. I'm going to start writing. I'm going to try to, create whatever it is. So I'm going to do. That's the second step in the Deming cycle. Then you get to the third step, which is checking. So you get feedback. You get notes about stuff. You notice issues. You see if things need to change, what you need to reiterate. And then that fourth step is to actually do the reiteration, to go back and use that feedback to inform decisions. and revise the work that you have. So, you've already done the work in step 2. Now this is just saying, all right, I collected some outside perspective on this. I have my own perspective on it. Now I'm going to go back and actually work with that in terms of feedback and use that to inform my decisions there. Just keeping an eye on time. I have a couple more slides left, and then I'm happy to take some questions if anybody has any. Obviously, and I'm sure, entering this space, you were probably like, when is this guy going to talk about AI models? It's just on everybody's mind right now. And let me be unequivocally clear that in talking about them, I represent just my own personal opinion, not that of JHU or EP or the CLDT, the center I work for. But AI models can be used in a way to offload some of the tedious parts of your own writing. For instance, I like to use it when I can't remember, say, the structure of a particular thing. So I might say to ChatGPT, what's the typical structure of a white paper? And then it will give me, like, oh, there's usually an introduction, and then there's like a methodology section, and then there's this section and this one. Excuse me, none of that is that's very general information, but it's information I don't want to keep in my head. Like I don't have space for keeping track of all the conventions of that form. I just want like a robot to tell me that that's the order in which they typically appear, and those are typically the components of that form. Then I can go in and create my own original language in there. So I think you should ask robots to do the boring stuff that you don't want to do. And then you get to do the fun stuff, which is the original thought, right? You get to come in and actually create the stuff. But, I've even asked ChatGPT, like, for a list of things, like just to aggregate something for me, like a list of people currently working on such and such type of project, something like that, where, I could do that and I could compile that, but it takes time for me to do. And it's super boring for me to do that. If a machine can do that for me, great. Then I can take that and run with it. Like I don't need it to. I'm a better writer than ChatGPT, but it can do the stuff that I would rather not do, and I can outsource it to that. They can also show you demos of the basic components of writing. So you can say like, show me what the structure of such and such usually looks like. It can show you, I've noticed that because of its, of all the stuff it's trained on, a lot of these models understand pretty well how to transition from one paragraph to another, from one thought to another. So it's nice to just see a model of that. It's nice to see, how you could accomplish that by replicating it in some way, by emulating it, I should say. And then, what the sort of, how narrow or how wide a focus on a particular subject is another way to think about what these models can demo for you. So, I think that there are ways to utilize this that are not problematic, but instead are just shrewd ways, smart ways of utilizing a tool. So with that, I'll open it up for questions. We have a few minutes left. I'll stop sharing so that we can see each other if you want. Feel free to just unmute and ask a question, or put it in the chat too if you want. I see a couple coming in. Can you please also recommend a good tool for organizing the ideas and writing? I use Word and find it kind of messy and all over the place for tracking ideas. Yeah, I know what you mean. I'm like a little bit old school in that I often produce or I draft in Word. But I totally know what you mean. It does get a little bit chaotic trying to keep track of all the different pieces. So one thing I can say is if you are using a word processor, to try to do transitional drafts, this was taught to me by a really fantastic writer. So, you're working on a thing and, let's call it a grant application. So, you save the file like of your first draft as grant application 1, and then you go back to that in a new document. You copy everything from that original one, you paste it into a new document, and you say, all right, I'm going to work on one thing in here. Like I'm just going to work on one section, or I'm going to work on one particular kind of it. And then you save that as grant application 2. And then you do that again. You copy all of that, you paste it into a new document, you work on one different element of it, you save that as grant application 3. Now what you've done though is if you ever need to go back to a previous version of something, you can just go back to it very easily by tracking back to previous versions of the documents. It's sort of a it's sort of a manual way to do a time machine, like a Mac OS time machine. Other apps, Scrivener is one that some people like, but it's more tailored to creative writing. I think this is where project management software can be a nice tool, because it's sort of designed to help you manage different components of a process. And so, if you just like get a free Airtable account, or you have access to something like Asana, Monday, those sorts of project management tools at work, or if you even if you build something in Excel, some way to like manage all those different pieces is nice. But it's a great question, and I'll keep thinking about it too. And I'll have a report of who attended, and the questions. So I'll follow up with you if I think of anything that's better than those. Really, really awesome question. Scott, what's the best way to overcome writer's block? Yeah, I mean, if you figure it out, let the rest of us know. Part of it to me is that habitual practice. If you say, this is the time that I go to work, this is when I get this type of work done, it definitely helps you push through something like writer's block. Sometimes it's giving yourself permission to say, I'm not going to do it, and I'm going to walk away, and I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to go have a glass of wine, whatever it is you want to do. And then you can come back to it later, and it doesn't feel as obligatory. I think part of writer's block can feel sort of like, oh, I'm obligated to do it and I have to do it. And if you release yourself from that condition, then I think it can be helpful. And just sort of writing in the sense that you are maybe not even working directly on the thing, but just sitting down and sort of like, it's sort of the equivalent of doodling, but with language. So if you just, make a list of things, or, something that's not at all formal, but just is a super informal thing that you put together, I think that can help you push through as well. Yeah, absolutely. Exercise can help. Absolutely. 100%. So many times I have like gotten up from the desk and gone on a walk and come back, and your thinking is just much clearer, and it's much better. Lynn saying, do you recommend using outlines to brainstorm? Do you use another method to get started with a writing project, or is there a good app to help with brainstorming? I often use outlines for technical stuff that I'm producing. I find it pretty nice because it again can remind you of the scope of the project, and scope creep happens to all of us, right? And so it can be a nice way to frame out that scope and help prevent you from meandering outside of it sometimes. I think brainstorming is another place where you can utilize a feedback system where if you've built up a little community, or, and I say community, a community can be of 2 people, it can be 3 people. But if you can bounce ideas off of other people in brainstorming, I know sometimes you're working on proprietary stuff, but if people are, can be privy to the information you're working with, and you can bounce ideas off of them, that can be a nice way to brainstorm. I don't know of a good app to do brainstorming. I haven't found something, because I think brainstorming is kind of wild. It's not really like a thing that's contained very easily, because it's just sort of like throwing things up on a whiteboard and stuff. But I've done some brainstorming, speaking of whiteboards, with the Zoom whiteboard. And every EP student, every Hopkins student has access to a licensed Zoom account. You could use a whiteboard and meet with folks, or just for yourself. Sometimes I'll just create a meeting and use a whiteboard. So that can be a way to try to brainstorm. But yeah, I think it's smart to be doing that. Let's see, there's other questions here. Writing a white paper, there's a lot of literature to cite and introduce. How do you make decisions of papers to cite out of all the possibilities in the research literature? Wow, what an interesting question, Sarah. I think ultimately it comes down to what will help you make the argument that you are trying to make. Like, what is the most concise way that you can bolster your own argument? And so, whether it's quantitative data that you've pulled together, or whether it's something qualitative, being able to cite a source is like, it's ballast for your own argument. It bolsters your own argument. And so then you can present that from a strength of position, and from a position of strength. So I think a lot of it is about determining the best way to support your own argument. And sometimes it's also about like, who's going to be reading this, like who's the audience for this, and then who are the, or what are the entities, or who are the people that audience really assigns a lot of credibility to. So, is it for the NSF and they're very science minded? Is it for a more lay audience, or something where you can take a more popular statistic or something? So I think a lot of it is determined by being very aware of your audience, and then understanding how to best put yourself forward in the argument that you're making rhetorically. Really cool question. Maybe time for one more. If there's one more, I'm looking through the chat and trying to make sure I'm not missing anything. Think we've got everything, but if I didn't address your question, let me know. Or any questions on mic, if anybody wants to ask, happy to do that too.
I had one on ChatGPT and scientific literature. I wrote it in the box, and I don't know if you can see it.
Let me see if I can find it. You want to just tell me? I'm sorry. Oh, is it about a conference?
Yeah.
I heard in another conference addressing use of ChatGPT for scientific literature writing. What aspects of scientific literature would be accurate in addressing? To what extent do you think it could be useful? Yeah, I think we're all collectively trying to figure out the answer to this. I don't think I would be going out of my lane, so to speak, to tell you a definitive answer to that. I think that again, this is just my personal opinion. I'm not speaking on behalf of any entity. I think it's inevitable that that these tools get folded into our work. I just don't know what that's going to look like. Where I think they're most useful right now is in helping figure out the sort of templated pieces or doing that more laborious work of aggregating information that's already public. And then, what you do with that and your original thought is really like the key. I don't know, exactly what the scientific application is at this point. It's just hard to say because we're so early. It's crazy how quickly it evolves. And yet, we're so early and even understanding. Like, we don't even understand what intelligence is, let alone artificial intelligence, right? Like, intelligence is some sort of like subjective, we have some subjective sense of what it is. We don't understand consciousness yet. Like, that's a construct that we don't understand. So it's tough. And the university and all universities are sort of in this liminal space of trying to figure out exactly what to do with these tools and what their applications will be. I mean, it's fascinating, and I look forward to seeing whatever happens with them. And if you end up using any of them and they're fruitful or they're frustrating, I'd love to hear about it. Let me know for sure. But yeah, I think that's the best. That's the best I can give you now.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah, of course. Of course. All right. I think we're out of time. We're right on time. So again, thank you so much. I really appreciate y'all joining. This is such a pleasure for me, and I'm glad y'all were interactive and participated. So awesome to get to actually hear from you. And I hope we get to do this more. And please don't be a stranger. Feel free to reach out anytime. And thanks so much.
Thank you. Great event.
Thank you. Take care.